Hey there, this is Dr. Claw with an explanation of our second paper for the term, the comparative paper. So this is a longer paper, as you can see. However, what I've done is allowed you and actually encouraged you to use your close reading paper as a foundation for this comparative paper. You've already gained mastery in the topic of your close reading paper. You know a lot about the text you're looking at, and so I strongly encourage you to use that mastery that you've already established and compare it to something new that you've discovered or that we've been reading in the later section of the term. So that's the general goal of the comparative paper. One thing to note is that you will need to submit this paper on time in order to have it graded for final exam exemption. So if you are hoping to exempt that final exam for this class through getting an A on all the assignments, you'll have to have this paper in on time. Otherwise, if you're not worried about trying to exempt, then the usual late penalty applies. So just something to keep in mind. Now, the goal, the kind of theoretical goal, intellectual goal of this paper is to expand your ability to draw larger conclusions by comparing concepts in more than one text. So this is going to give you the opportunity to do something actually kind of similar to what you've been doing in the Avatar project, in that you're looking at how multiple texts are treating a common concept and seeing if you can learn something about that concept by seeing how it's represented in more than one text. You all have a rough draft for this paper that's due November 8th. That will be due into the rough draft of the comparative paper assignment, and that's a Turnitin assignment because just like last time, we're going to have a peer review element, and the peer review works through Turnitin. And then the final draft of this is due November 20th, which is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. I wanted y'all to have the opportunity to have this off your plate before you leave for Thanksgiving break or before you have that break. So just keep that in mind. It will give you a few more weeks to work on it. I will ask for you to color code the final draft, so it's worth potentially color coding your rough draft just as you turn it in. But if you don't want to color code the rough draft, that's fine. That's just something for the final draft. So let's have a look at these prompts. Each prompt reflects one of the 4 prompts from the close reading paper. And then I've added an additional prompt on free will because that's been a big topic as we jumped into Paradise Lost, and it will continue to be an important topic through the remainder of the term. So the first prompt draws on the bodies prompt from the close reading paper. And here I'm asking you to look at 2 or 3 texts from our syllabus using your original text from the close reading paper. And then at least one of the other texts needs to be from units 2 through 4. So in other words, you can't write your entire comparative paper only on text from unit 1. At least one of those texts needs to be from beyond unit 1. And that's because the texts beyond Unit 1 also move forward in time, and I just want to make sure that you are looking at a variety of texts here. Okay, so you're looking for a larger concept, and this could be something like big questions that it asks or moral dilemmas. It could even be something like social roles determined by bodies, or even how you're noticing that characters' appearances seem to dictate how they're treated. That could even be like the big issue type thing for this prompt. Okay, and then in prompt 2, this is derived from the fantasy prompt. And we are still seeing fantastical elements. There are very few texts in our syllabus that don't have fantastical elements. So this is an opportunity for you to look at different ways that authors are using fantasy. And as I note here in the prompt, you might compare one of the religious fantasies like the Fairy Queen or Paradise Lost to one of the more secular fantasies like Beowulf, or even a scientific fantasy like Frankenstein or The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And note that if you are interested in writing on the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's very short. The entire text is, I want to say, like 45, 50 pages. So you could actually read that early and be able to write about it. It's a very quick read. Also very intriguing and thought-provoking. So that could be a lot of fun. So same standards as the first one I mentioned. All of your text should not come from Unit 1. So at least one of your comparative text needs to come from beyond Unit 1. Here you're trying to look for the patterns. So patterns in the way that texts use fantasy to accomplish their literary purpose. So part of this prompt will also be establishing the literary purpose, and that can be very straightforward. So sometimes authors will tell you, like Milton says, the purpose of Paradise Lost is to justify the ways of God to man. And he says that right at the beginning of book 1. And sometimes it's not so clear, and you have to sort of make an interpretive analysis of what you think that the author is trying to communicate, and what the purpose of their text was. Okay, and then these are some of the questions that I pulled from the previous prompt. All right, prompt 3 is the free will prompt, and I know a lot of you are interested in that one. And just to be clear, you can use this one as like a fresh prompt, where you're not using your close reading paper, but you could also probably use a lot of your close reading papers for the free will prompt, because I'm also asking about fate and destiny, and so that's going to be relevant to things like the heroes and villains prompt. If you're looking at free will, you could think about the concept of freedom and social roles, and that could connect to things like 12th Night and Orinoco, and from our earlier text, any of the female bodies roles, like if you wrote about violence against women, any of those would work for that idea of like freedom and free will. So that's something to think about. You don't have to, your close reading paper doesn't have to have been about literal free will, and your text from your close reading paper doesn't have to talk explicitly about free will in the way that Paradise Lost does, in order for you to be able to ask questions about, are these characters actually free to make their own choices? So that's maybe a good articulation of free will that you can keep in mind as you're trying to think flexibly about how your close reading paper might fit in with this. Are the characters free to make their own choices? Okay. And here in my questions for this one, I'm asking you to think about free will and it, by contrast, fate, destiny, providence, that kind of thing. I'm also asking you to think about responsibility. So if they don't have free will, then who's responsible for the choices that they make? And then finally, when you compare the way these multiple texts are looking at free will, what can you learn from the relationship between free will, fate, and responsibility? So responsibility is actually a key part of that text, of that prompt. Okay, and then I have a prompt derived from the heroes and villains prompt that many of you wrote on for the close reading paper. So this is thinking about protagonists who might not be entirely moral. Satan in Paradise Lost is a great example of this. He has a lot of appealing attributes. He's a great leader. He has his own sense of justice and ethics. He lives by a code, and yet he clearly isn't a good guy. He's clearly immoral in a lot of ways. Like he's got beef with God, and because of that he's willing to harm Adam and Eve, and he thinks this through out loud. He's like, hey, these two haven't done anything to me, and I don't really want to hurt them, but hurting them is the best way I can hurt God, so I'm going to hurt them anyway. So you can see that he is morally compromised, and yet he's got these appealing characteristics. And he's certainly not the only protagonist in our readings that has this kind of moral grayness to him. So that's something that you could look at if you did the heroes and villains text. How are texts convincing us to root for or cheer for these protagonists who might not be entirely moral? And a protagonist is the character whose actions and choices drive the plot along. So like Viola is a great example of a protagonist in 12th Night, because it's her choices that really move the plot along. Her choice to cross-dress creates the love triangle. Her choice to dressed in particular as her brother creates all the identity confusion at the end between Sebastian and Antonio and Olivia. So that's an example of what a protagonist is. Okay. Oh, and for morality, I want you to look at how the text is defining something as moral or immoral. So look at what the narrator is saying and the tone and the word choice about what these characters are doing to determine if the text is presenting that action as a moral action or an immoral action. So I want you to use the text definition of morality rather than relying on your own personal one. Okay, and then finally we have the update of the violence against women prompt. And here I'm asking you to think about justice and the way that texts are using violence against women to think through concepts of justice and yeah, if there's a way in which they use this violence to illustrate beliefs about justice or maybe a miscarriage of justice. There's a character in Frankenstein that's heavily involved with this concept of justice, and her name is Justine. So that might be a really exciting thing for you to look at if you did the violence against women prompt for the first paper and would like to pursue this idea of justice and women. So similarly, I want you to think about the text definition of justice. So how does the text present the actions and the things that are happening, the consequences? Does it present those consequences as good and right and as carrying out justice, or does it present those consequences as maybe something that is a miscarriage of justice, as I said before? So anyway, these are the prompts that I have set up to try to help you expand your close reading paper and turn it into a comparative paper. And note that the comparative paper is still about close reading. So I still want you to base all of your evidence on the texts that you're looking at. Use words and phrases to support the analysis that you are conducting. Use those claim formulas where you're looking at what the text is doing and how that thing affects the reader's understanding of the text, or maybe what impact the reader receives and how the text creates that impact, if you want to take that kind of big picture first approach. And a couple of you have asked about using research for this paper, and if you do want to use a research source for this paper, I'll need you to email me directly with an explanation of why you want to use the research, like what type of research you're hoping to use, and then an indication of how you know if a source is scholarly, because that's going to be important if you want to use research sources. Otherwise, if you aren't interested in using research sources, then just use our text from our syllabus, and that's all you got to do. You're not required to do anything beyond that. So as always, post any questions that you have to Yellowdig and be sure to tag me with the @ symbol, or you can also email me directly. Thanks.